Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the Phia Group.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest installment in the Phia Group's podcast, Empowering Plans. I am John Jablon, and this is Kendall Jackson. Say hi, Kendall.
Hello.
Thank you for not saying hi, Kendall. That's a Ron and a Brady thing, and I hate it. But anyway, today we are going to talk about a topic that is, for better or for worse, it is near and dear to all of our hearts. Essential health benefits. The name is a bit of a misnomer because, even though they may be considered essential, they don't have to be covered. And so that's where a lot of the confusion lies. And we wanted to jump on this podcast today and talk about what exactly an EHB is, and really more importantly, what an EHB is not. So without further ado, Kendall, why don't you take it away?
So I think the best place to start is really about choosing a state benchmark. So every self-funded health plan has to choose a state benchmark, and that state benchmark will outline the benefits that the state considers to be essential health benefits. Now, when choosing a state benchmark, the plan has complete free reign to choose any state that it wants to. It has 51 benchmarks to choose from, one from each state, and there's also a benchmark for DC as well. And now, when deciding which benchmark you want to choose, you have several different considerations, different things to think about. Now, the first consideration is going to be employer location. And I really want to stress here that the benchmark does not have to be related to where the group is located or where the employer has the most employees. This is simply just a factor to consider. Some employers, because of their employer location, elect to choose that state where they're located, particularly if they decide to mirror state-mandated benefits, regardless of whether or not they're required to cover those benefits. But they may sort of think that based on their situation, the state that they're located is the best state benchmark for them. But again, that's not required. They can choose a state that they're not located in, that they have no employees in.
So, Kendall, I've always sort of assumed that when employers do choose their own state, it's either because they think they have to, or because they just want to make sure that, people in the state are sort of like, well, the state guarantees me these benefits. And even though the plan is self-funded and assuming it's governed by ERISA, right, it doesn't have to cover those benefits. It's sort of a continuity thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that?
Yeah.
Does that?
No, I think that's fair. I think that's exactly how people tend to think about it. But yeah, we just want to stress here that it's not required. You certainly have the option to choose the state where you're located, but you don't have to. Another big consideration is to take a look at the plan and identify which benefits the plan currently has dollar limits for, and then potentially select a benchmark that considers those benefits to not be essential health benefits. And the reason for that would be to maintain the dollar limits that you already have, because as we'll get to further later in this outline, that you can't have dollar limits for EHBs. So if you currently have dollar limits for some benefits, it may be best to choose a benchmark that doesn't designate them as EHBs, so you can keep those dollar limits and sort of minimize any plan changes that you need to make after selecting that benchmark.
Yeah, and something worth mentioning, Kendall's using the phrase dollar limits. The literal law says annual or lifetime dollar limits, but I really like Kendall's phrasing because we've seen plans that have, for instance, a monthly dollar limit. Mm-hmm. Even though the law talks about annual or lifetime dollar limits, a monthly dollar limit, if you multiply it by 12, is an annual dollar limit. So you cannot get around that. That is not a loophole. You can't say, well, we don't have any annual dollar limits, we have monthly dollar limits. No, you have annual dollar limits if you have monthly dollar limits. So yeah, Kendall, I really like the general sort of dollar limits because people often think of it as lifetime or annual specifically, but it's just math. You multiply a month by 12, You've got to.
Yeah, exactly. Now, at Phia, we've seen a lot of plans, and we come into contact with groups from every state. And most often, we see plans electing to choose Utah as their state benchmark. That's by far the most common.
Do you know why exactly, Kendall? Do you have examples?
Yeah, and sort of the reasoning behind this is because certain benefits that often have dollar limits imposed on them by plans are not EHBs in Utah. And so some good examples of those are bariatric surgery, infertility, and hearing aids. So those three are not EHBs in Utah. So if a plan elects Utah as their state benchmark, they could impose dollar limits on those benefits if they want to do so. And so, yeah, Utah is one where it's not an EHB. So, for example, bariatric surgery, not an EHB in Utah, but it is an EHB in other states like California, Colorado, Massachusetts, and a number of other states. And so once you've chosen your state benchmark, a question we often get asked is, where do we put this? Where do we document it? There's no sort of federal requirement in the rules that the state benchmark be included or listed in the SPD, but it should be documented somewhere. And typically the plan document is the most intuitive place to include it. Yeah, so John, you want to take over on some treatment of EHBs and how plans should be handling coverage for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So essential health benefits, I mentioned this in the very beginning, even though they are technically called essential, that doesn't necessarily mean what it sounds like it means, right? I mean, a lot of people hear, well, oh, they're essential, then we have to cover them. No, there is no federal requirement for an ERISA plan to cover essential health benefits. The only requirements for essential health benefits are, one, that you cannot impose lifetime or annual or monthly dollar limits on those EHBs, and two, that they have to count towards the out-of-pocket max. And Kendall's going to talk, or I'll talk about that in a bit, I guess. I like that topic. But there are 10 broad categories of essential health benefits, and the details of what's in those categories is left up to the states. That's where we get the benchmarks. That is why each state has its own benchmark plan. And the format of those plans is pretty much like a full health plan's schedule of benefits. It talks about which benefits are covered and at what amounts and at what limits. So it's certainly not that the rules about EHBs say that you can't limit benefits. Obviously, you can still limit benefits, but the rules are just about annual or lifetime dollar limits. It's all about dollars. It has nothing to do with visit limits, right? I mean, essential health benefits, you can impose visit limits all you want. You just can't impose dollar limits. It's very, very important too. And, which state benchmark plan you choose, again, it doesn't require you to mirror that state's benefits. That is probably the most common misconception that so many people in the industry have, is that when you choose a benchmark, it doesn't mean that those are your benefits. It does not mean that. It only means that those are the benefits that you cannot place annual or lifetime dollar limits on. So the way I look at it, excuse me, we've mentioned before that some plans choose a state benchmark that they're in for continuity. So the employees in that state don't feel like they are getting shafted. They don't feel like they are losing out on benefits that the state really wants employers to cover. But realistically, if that is not the employer's concern, if the employer really just wants sort of the maximum freedom, which I would say probably most self-funded plans do, then Utah, like Kendall mentioned, Utah tends to be the leanest benchmark plan, and there's no reason not to choose it. You can still cover more than it requires, right? You don't have to place annual or lifetime dollar limits on things even that aren't EHBs, but why not pick the state benchmark with the least restriction? That seems pretty intuitive to me, and I think that's why so many plans choose Utah, because the same thing is intuitive to them. They say, well, we're going to go with the least restrictive one and then sort of do what we want from there. It's a weird system. And again, the fact that they're called essential health benefits, don't let that fool you. Don't let that terminology make you think that they have to be covered. Even though they're essential, and even though we very often see providers and patients saying, like, well, you can't deny this benefit, it's essential. That term probably could have been different when the law was originally drafted. It is sort of a misnomer, and there may even have been some political undertones, right? Maybe they used the word essential to try to encourage employers to cover it and basically say, like, do the right thing. This one's essential. You should cover this. But that's just not the actual requirement. So for examples, right? Colorado's state benchmark plan, there are a lot of benefits that are EHBs, including stuff like hearing aids, whereas other states, and in particular Utah, hearing aids are not considered an essential health benefits. So like even stuff that seems so intuitive, and you might think to yourself, well, yeah, obviously every state's going to talk about hearing aids. It's it's not that simple, right? I mean, different states have done different things, and it also depends on sort of the date, right? Because this was an ACA rule. This was passed back in, I think it was passed in 2010, and I think this all went effective 2011, and the benchmark plans were chosen as of 2011. That's a long time ago. A lot may have changed since that. Whole mindsets of health plans have changed since then, but 2011 is sort of where it was locked into, and the states have, changed a bit since then, but a lot of them also haven't. It takes a lot for a state to change its benchmark plan. It's a lot of planning and a lot of work, and a lot of states have not done it for quite some time. So, for instance, right, to go with the Colorado example, for a self-funded plan with Colorado as its chosen benchmark, again, no matter where it is in the country, even though hearing aids may be an EHB, the plan is still not required to cover them. But if you do cover them, you cannot impose lifetime or annual or monthly or daily or biannually or, dollar limits, period. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kendall. You want to talk about some mandated benefits?
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about the difference between state mandated benefits and essential health benefits. And I think sort of part of the confusion there is that misconception that you have to cover every EHB in the benchmark. But now that we sort of dispelled that misconception, we can really talk about the difference between state mandated benefits and EHBs. So like we said, unlike EHBs, state mandated benefits are different because there are specific services that health plans subject to state law are legally required to cover based on certain legislation passed within that state. And it can be really anything for the required coverage. It could be just a variety of different care treatment services, depending on what the law says. And the associated requirements for that benefit would be listed within that law as well. Now, state mandated benefits are typically only a concern for non-ERISA plans because non-ERISA plans, like non-federal governmental plans or church plans, are subject to state law. Now, because of ERISA preemption, which operates to preempt the state law from requiring coverage for a specific benefit, ERISA plans would not be subject to those state mandated benefits. So they would not be required to cover them. And I think it's even more important to state that you have to actually look at the language of the law for that mandated benefit. Just because you're a non-ERISA plan doesn't mean it will necessarily apply to you, even though you're subject to state law, because a lot of the time states will pass certain laws mandating benefits, but they won't be applicable to self-funded health plans entirely. And the law itself will only be attempting to regulate fully insured plans within the state. So if that were the case, non-ERISA plans, because they're self-funded, wouldn't actually be subject to that state mandate, and they wouldn't be required to cover that state mandated benefit. It really just depends on how the law is written. But yeah, state mandated benefits are completely distinct from EHBs, and depending on the language in the law, anyone subject to state law would have to cover those state mandated benefits. So.
Yeah, and it is worth mentioning that there's often a lot of overlap, right? I mean, when a state has made its benchmark plan and says, these are the essential health benefits, a lot of the times the legislature says, well, we do consider these essential, and therefore we are going to pass specific laws that require people to cover them because we think they're essential. Yeah. So, yeah, it's certainly not the case that everything that's an essential health benefit in a given state is necessarily a state mandated benefit rather. But I think it's safe to say, Kendall, would you agree that there's no law in any state that requires anybody to cover anything that's not an essential health benefit, right? Because why wouldn't it be an EHB if you're taking the time and effort to pass laws to protect this service? Obviously, you're going to make it an EHB, right?
Yeah, typically, yeah.
Great. The last thing we wanted to cover was about the out-of-pocket maximum. And this is, I think we've used the word misconception probably a dozen times in this podcast, but that's why we're doing this topic, right? I mean, this is sort of a basic, or I should say, essential health benefits are a basic framework that self-funded plans need to keep in mind, but there's just so much confusion, and that's why we're here. And another area of confusion, a big area, is about the out-of-pocket max. The out-of-pocket max applies only to in-network services. For one thing, it does not apply to out-of-network services, and there's some confusion about that, but that's probably another story for another day. But the out-of-pocket max applies only to spending for essential health benefits. If it is not an essential health benefit, technically speaking, it does not need to count towards the out-of-pocket max. I repeat, if it is spending for a non-essential health benefit, it does not need to count toward the out-of-pocket max. That is something that it's so widely misunderstood, and it's probably because of the administrative burden in separating the two is so great that a lot of plans and TPAs just don't bother. They basically just say, like, we're going to count everything towards the out-of-pocket max, or everything in network, that is. Because trying to separate everything based on what's an essential health benefit versus what's not, and even sometimes different line items in the same claim. I mean, it really just depends on a TPA's processes. But according to the law and the regulations, and we can provide citations for this if need be, it is spending for essential health benefits only that has to count toward the out-of-pocket max. And I think that that's all I want to say on the topic. I could go into more detail. I could explain it more, but we've taken up so much of your time already, and I just want to make sure that we stress out-of-pocket max is only for essential health benefits by law. You certainly can count non-essential health benefits towards the out-of-pocket max, and frankly, most plans and TPAs do, because like I said, the burden of dividing everything is just such a pain, but you do not actually have to. And the way EHBs are structured is that realistically, the majority of services tend to be essential health benefits. That is just how it works, mainly because the essential health benefits that the plan benchmarks have chosen, there aren't a few. There are a lot. The lists are long, So it just so happens that most benefits tend to be essential health benefits. So the distinction between essential versus non-essential, there certainly is a distinction, but it's minimized. So just keep that in mind. So Kendall, any final thoughts?
No, I think this was really productive. I think we cleared up some common issues that we see with these topics. So yeah, I think this was great.
I hope so. Awesome. If anybody listening has questions or comments or insults or whatever it may be, please let us know. Email your ICE inbox or P2C referral, whichever applies. And thank you so much for listening. And on behalf of myself, John Jablon, and Kendall Jackson, we'll be in touch soon. Thanks so much.